think I'll add on this that I don't know about all folks or men or women, but I use my phone actually a whole lot less like a phone these days. That may sound odd, but I probably do about 90% of, I probably use this 90% of the time with other things besides a phone. Anyway, I was just thinking about that a moment ago. On the screen behind me, you see a picture of our website, apologeticspress.org, and one of the reasons I'm mentioning this is to show you how easy it is to navigate and to get to some of the information that we are dealing with this weekend. You can go, for example, you can click on Alleged Bible or just Alleged Discrepancies here, and it will take you to a page that looks like this, where you can click on, for example, the Old Testament or the New Testament. If you click on the Old Testament book of Genesis, it will take you to a page of a number of articles that are separated by verse and the title of the article that's associated with that particular verse. You can go back and you can click on, for example, too much activity on day 6. Did Adam name all of the animals on day 6? And it will take you to that article. You can go back to Alleged Discrepancies. You can click on the New Testament book of Matthew and look at, for example, the article, in what order did Satan tempt Jesus? According to Matthew, his order of temptations is different than Luke's. And so this article would explain why you would have a different order that is mentioned there. All right, for the remainder of this particular hour, I want us to look at really what a contradiction is and is not. Again, I think it's easy to say to someone they have contradicted themselves, or that is a contradiction, or the Bible writers made a number of mistakes and contradictions, until we really think about what a contradiction is. Aristotle made the statement years ago in his book Metaphysics, the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject and in the same respect. Let me read that again. The same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject, notice the same time, the same subject, and in the same respect. He went on to say, it is impossible for the same man at the same time to believe the same thing to be and not to be. You see, I can't look at that door over there. If I say that door is at this very moment open, and I say that door at this very moment is shut, and I am referring to the same door at the same time and using the terms open and shut in the same respect or in the same sense, then I have just contradicted myself. But you see, what Aristotle is pointing out is we must be talking about the same thing at the same time and in the same respect for there to be a legitimate contradiction. If I say, for example, Ricky Smith is rich and Ricky Smith is poor, on the surface someone might allege, well, these statements, they not only differ, they may contradict, or someone may allege that those are contradictory statements. But could it not be that we are referring to two different Ricky Smiths? Could we be referring to a Ricky Smith in Alaska being rich and one in Alabama that is poor? You see, the first principle to consider is the same person, place, or thing must be under consideration when you are comparing Bible passages. If we say Ricky Smith is rich and Ricky Smith is poor, and we are talking about the same person, we still may not be contradicting ourselves, because we might be referring to the young, poor Ricky Smith and the older, rich Ricky Smith. We may be referring to the same person, but at two different times in his life. When he is young and maybe he is inexperienced and he doesn't have much work, versus a Ricky Smith who has been working for 50 years and has more wealth. Well, you might be referring to the same person, place, or thing, but you must also make sure you are referring to the same time period when you are comparing Bible passages. These are not difficult things to remember, actually. Again, it seems like in everyday life, we generally understand, we kind of need to make sure that we're talking about the same time here. We're talking about the same thing. We're talking about the same time, the same thing, in the same, the third principle being, in the same respect or in the same sense. You could make the statements, Ricky Smith is rich and Ricky Smith is poor, be referring to the same Ricky Smith, be referring to the same Ricky Smith at the same time, and still not be contradicting yourself if you are using the terms poor and rich in different senses or in different respects. Have you ever known someone who is materially poor but spiritually rich? What is it that James said in James 2:5? Has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith? So there again, we must consider this third principle, and that is the same sense must be under consideration. So these are three principles that for the next 30 minutes or so I'd like for us to expound upon. Principle number one, the same person, place, or thing must be under consideration. If we said, reading from Acts chapter 12, that James died in Acts chapter 12 based upon Acts 12 verses 1 and 2, and then we turn over to the book of Acts chapter 15, and we read where James was still alive and he was communicating things to Christians there in Acts 15, would it be fair for us to say that there is an obvious contradiction here? No, not at all, because we have what? We have two different Jameses being discussed here. And so this is kind of a rather easy to understand example, elementary example, and I don't know that I've ever heard anyone contend that this was a contradiction. And the reason they wouldn't is because they would understand the same person, or excuse me, two different people could wear the same name, and that the same name could be referring to two different people and under consideration in two different chapters of Scripture. Now, this is one that more people have had an issue with. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24, we read where the inspired writer wrote that the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. But the skeptic says, well, wait a minute. When I read Jesus' statements in Matthew 23, Matthew wrote that Jesus referred to this Zechariah as the Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. And so the skeptic says, you see, here's a mistake. Either Jesus made a mistake or Matthew made a mistake when he wrote it down, and it contradicts what we read in 2 Chronicles 24. But using this first principle, is the same person under consideration, it's a valid principle to bring up because it is possible that Jesus is not referring to the Zechariah of 2 Chronicles 24, the son of Jehoiada. He could truthfully be referring to a different Zechariah who is indeed the son of Berechiah. For example, could it not be that Jesus was referring to Zechariah the minor prophet, who preached during the days of Ezra, Ezra 5:1, approximately 400 years after Zechariah the son of Jehoiada? Could Jesus have been referring to him? Now, here's the thing. The skeptic says, well, wait a minute. That the death of that prophet is not recorded in the Old Testament. And Jesus was referring to a prophet who had died in Matthew 23, and thus they assume he was referring to the prophet in 2 Chronicles chapter 24. But could he not be referring to Zechariah the minor prophet? Y'all hang with me here. I know it might be easy to kind of get lost here, but we're referring to Zechariah. Could it be that Jesus was not referring to the Zechariah that the chronicler referred to in 2 Chronicles 24? And that, for example, he may have been referring to Zechariah the minor prophet. The skeptic says, wait a minute, his death is not recorded, to which my response would be, could the Son of God not know how he died without it being recorded in the Old Testament? I would contend, yes, he certainly could have known how the minor prophet Zechariah could have known how he died, either miraculously by him supernatural knowledge that he had, or from even perhaps Jewish tradition. Now here's what's very interesting, is that when you look at Zechariah the minor prophet, he's actually referred to as the son of Berechiah in Zechariah 1:1. But you know, even with this explanation being, I think, extremely possible and probable, remember the second point that we made last hour, the second principle? Any possible solution should suffice. There's more than just one possibility here. I don't know. It could be that Jesus was referring to him. It may be that Jesus was referring to a prophet that was killed in the first century. Notice when you read Jesus' statement here in Matthew 23, he's referring to the enemies of his day. And he says, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now, when he uses the term you, he could be referring to you as in you, the Jews, your ancestors who did this. But perhaps he's referring to someone there in the first century. I don't know the answer, but I know these are two very possible answers. Well, someone says, Eric, I read in Matthew 5 that Jesus went up on a mountain and he delivered one of the most masterful sermon you'll ever read. But then I read in Luke chapter 6 where it says he came down with them and stood on a level place. And so the question, and it's a fair question to ask, is how could Jesus be on a mountain and on a level place and deliver this lesson? Well, I think when you consider the first principle here, are we referring to the same person, place, or thing at the same time in the same sense? Well, the first principle, are we referring to the same person, place, or thing? Could it be that this is not the same place? Could it be that Jesus preached the same lesson at two different places? Have you ever known a preacher to preach the same lesson at more than one place? I hope that Jesus did. I mean, the greatest teacher who ever lived, don't you think if he preached a lesson in Galilee and the people in Judea didn't get that lesson, don't you kind of think, wow, he should preach that lesson down there? I preach a lot of lessons, a lot of the same lessons in different places, and are there differences in those lessons? Certainly, there's differences. And if people had a recording and said, well, this is a contradiction, someone wrote this down, well, it could be that it was said at a different place, at a different time. Or maybe we are referring to the same place, but a different part of that place. You know what I'm saying? Is it physically possible to be on a mountain on a level place? I think we understand that. If you go to Alaska, you will hear of a mountain or see a mountain in Anchorage, Alaska called Flat Top Mountain. There is a mountain that you have to spend, depending on how fast you walk and climb and run, an hour and a half hiking up, and you can get to the top of it. A little bit dangerous. And it is, you could probably play a football field on top of this mountain. It's known as Flat Top Mountain. So you could actually be referring to basically the same place, but a tad different place at the same place. And I'm not trying to make this complicated. I'm trying to let us see, well, wait a minute. Is it possible for both of these statements to be true? And my contention is it's not only very possible, it should be considered perfectly accurate in view of these differences being the kinds of differences that we see in everyday life. In what order did Satan tempt Jesus? I put this one in here as we are talking about this next principle of the same time being under consideration, just to consider us and how we view matters and whether we are talking about them sequentially, chronologically, or just kind of without order in mind. Are there some times that you say things and you talk about what you've done on a particular day and you don't necessarily mean to rehearse everything you've done in the exact order in which you did it? You know, if you come home from work and you tell your husband or your wife, hey, I did this, and this. I imagine there are some people in here that your personality is such, you just kind of went from the morning till afternoon and you kind of rehearsed what you did. And then there are others who the way you work is more topical, and you just kind of think of, well, this was the biggest thing I did today, and that was the next major thing I did, and it's kind of in a different, you order things differently because you are thinking about them in view of maybe what's the most important, or what's the most memorable, or what's the biggest. My oldest son would be your more chronologically minded person. If he's going to tell a story, if he went to Six Flags, he's going to say, well, we rode this roller coaster, then we rode this roller coaster, then we did this, and it's going to be pretty much in order. That's just the way he is. My other son, he's kind of my free spirit son, I suppose, which is a little dangerous sometimes. He's just kind of, he's going to be expressive and tell you, the biggest roller coaster you've ever seen, and he's going to talk about the Goliath at Six Flags, and even though maybe he rode that last. but that was maybe his favorite and the biggest. So you can order things differently, arrange them differently, and unless you have said, well, I'm arranging these in this particular order, you haven't contradicted yourself or someone else. Well, when we think about time, for example, and we'll get to that next point here in just a moment, we oftentimes think of chronology in time. Well, Matthew wrote that Satan tempted Jesus to turn stones to bread, to throw himself down off the pinnacle of the temple, and to fall down and worship him. But you can see how Luke's order is different. And so the skeptic says, well, this difference is a contradiction, to which you can logically and reasonably, and I would say kindly, respond. There's no proof that this is a contradiction. Either Matthew or Luke did not arrange it, perhaps both of them, but probably just one of them did not arrange it in chronological order for whatever reason they do not inform us about. But when you consider that there are extremely possible explanations for why someone can say they did something or that someone else did something, and it's not recorded in a strict chronological order, I think we need to be as fair with the Bible writers as we would be to ourselves. I realize on the surface someone could look at this and say, well, that's just strange. I was talking to a young lady one time about these passages, and you could just tell she was frustrated. She was aggravated. I just don't like that. Well, I'm sorry that maybe you don't like that. But it is what it is. And if someone says, well, why is it that way? My response is, well, I don't know for sure why it's that way. What I do know is this. It cannot and has not been proven to be some kind of mistake on the part of the Bible writer or on Jesus. There are legitimate reasons for why you would have these differences. Okay, so just to make sure we're all on the same page here, have you and someone else ever told something that you've done, and you've told it in different orders, and you've both been exactly correct in what you've said? I would imagine that. I don't see anybody shaking their heads, but I imagine you've done that before. I took my 2 sons with me to work this last week, and they worked for a few hours, and they did some schoolwork there at the Apologetics Press offices, and if I had asked them, what did you do today? Most likely, my oldest son is going to tell me what he did in chronological order, and my next son is going to just tell me what all he did in whatever order he wanted to tell me, because that's just kind of generally how those two work. So, all right, let's move on to the second principle. And that previous slide I put it in between these two principles because it had to do with understanding an important point about chronology. But the second important principle is the same time must be under consideration. If someone says, well, I read in Genesis 1 that everything was good, I read in Genesis 6 that everything was bad, that's an oversimplification of this, but you know where I'm going with this. If someone says that's the case, the obvious reasonable explanation is, wait a minute here. Between Genesis 1 and Genesis 6, we have a lot of time that's passed. Hundreds and hundreds of years. At one time, at the creation, everything was good. By the time Noah was about 500 years old, the earth was having some problems. And I don't mean the physical earth. I mean the people on the earth. So much so that the Bible says that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I tell you what, that's a planet I would not want to live on. We have problems in this country today. We have many problems in this world today. And my suggestion and encouragement to Christians is be the light, be the salt, preach the gospel, teach the gospel, tell people about how great our God is, about how wonderful His Word is, and how wonderful His Son is. And let's just pray there will always be a righteous remnant on this earth, that we can try to positively affect it so that it's never the case that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continual, at least for the vast, vast, vast majority of mankind. When some people read Genesis chapter 10 and they read that the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, the reference is to the languages of different people. And so there is an obvious indication here that you had more than just one language when you read Genesis 10, 5, 20, and 31. But yet just a few verses later we read, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And so the question, and again it's a legitimate question, is why does the Bible say in chapter 11 there's one speech and then there were all these other languages before then? And the answer is this, kind of related to the slide about the temptations of Jesus, and that is that not everything in Scripture is written in a strict chronological order. You know, a lot of times we have history books that, generally speaking, are in fairly chronological order from early history to more modern history. But then if you want to critically compare it, sometimes the chapters will overlap. Sometimes they'll be talking about the medieval period in India, and then they'll be talking about this period here in another area on earth that, even though it will be a later chapter, it might go back before the time it just ended with the chapter on India. So there's some overlapping, if you will. Not strict chronological order. Well, as you go through the Bible, what you're going to find is that not everything is written in strict chronological order. And what we have in chapter 11 is, you have some events in chapter 11 which take place when some of the things and before some of the things in chapter 10 actually happen. Because in chapter 10 what we have are the nations that descended from Noah, from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then in chapter 11 you have the account of the Tower of Babel and the confusion of the languages there. And what we have in chapter 11, if you go back to chapter 10, you have these events in chapter 11 most likely occurring during the time of Peleg. Notice chapter 10, verse 25. Because to Eber were born two sons, the name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. And then a few verses later we read, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And then a few verses later, the earth divided. That is, the people on the earth divided themselves according to their languages. The word earth in chapter 11, verse 1 is used in reference to the people. And I would contend that in chapter 10 and verse 25, you have the earth being divided in that, not the physical earth, but the people who were on the earth, so that what you read in chapter 11 actually took place during the period of time that some of the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth lived and are recorded, so that if you have in the days of Peleg the earth divided, it was after those days then that people were separated according to their language. All right, let's move on here. Let's go over this one, and then we'll skip to the last point, and then the lesson will be yours. This is probably one of, if not the most well-known alleged Bible discrepancy that I've heard. And it's not that it is that difficult to explain. It is just people have latched onto it because maybe it's a simple one to remember. When you read in Matthew 27 that Judas went out and hanged himself, and then you read in Acts chapter 1 that Luke recorded, he purchased a field with the wages of iniquity, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his entrails gushed out. That's not a very pleasant thought, not a very pleasant thing to say, read, or even just think about for a minute. But the accusation is, hey, these are two different descriptions of what happened to Judas, and they're contradictory. And then the question again to be asked is, are you certain they're contradictory, or is it possible that both of them could be true? Well, the fact is, we're talking about the same person, Judas. And we're still talking about the same general time, but is it possible for someone to go out and hang himself, and then a little while later, a little different time, the branch breaks, the rope breaks, or whatever ropes do that's cut, or something happens, and the body falls headlong and bursts open in the middle, and all of his guts come out? Is that a very possible, reasonable solution, explanation? I contend that it is, and I put it under this principle of making sure the same time is under consideration, because these two passages, strictly speaking, are not referring to the same exact time, because it's very possible he went out and hanged himself, and then after so many hours, or more likely days, his body fell for some reason we're not told about. Again, maybe a branch broke. And then, if you have a body, a human being, a mammal, as we are categorized, a mammal's body hanging or on the side of the road that is dead that is decomposing, what does it do? It expands, it swells. You've seen probably this time of the year a lot of deer that have been hit on the side of the road and they begin to swell. Well, it would have been very likely that the body of Judas would have begun to swell, and then it fell headlong, and as it swole, it burst open as it hit the ground. Again, we don't know everything about the situation. What we can know as Christians is there are logical explanations why this here could be true and why that there could be equally true. All right, and the last point is the same sense must be under consideration. We must be, if we're comparing Bible passages, let's make sure we're talking about the same person, place, or thing. Are we talking about Zechariah the son of Jehoiada or Zechariah the son of Berechiah? Is this the same person or different people? Let's make sure we're talking about the same time. When Judas hanged himself and then he fell headlong, burst open in the middle, and all his guts came out. Is that the exact same time, or is it possible that both of those things could happen within a few hours or days of each other? It's possible. And then thirdly, the same sense must be under consideration. Let's go back to the two passages we looked at earlier of 2 Chronicles 24 and Matthew 23. We said earlier that it's very possible here that this Zechariah son of Berechiah was Zechariah the minor prophet, who's actually referred to as Zechariah son of Berechiah. Maybe it was a prophet in the day of Jesus. I tend to think that's probably not the answer, but I suppose it's possible. Or is it possible, and is it possible, I'll just say or I guess, that this Zechariah and this Zechariah are the same people, but that the word son here and here are not used in the same sense? Let me ask you this. Do we ever use the word son, just us today, let's just set the Bible aside for just a moment. Do we ever use the word son today in different senses, in different respects, different contexts? One of my elders, he's called me son for a number of years. Hey, son, that's okay. But I'm not his literal son. I'm honored to be called a son, though. When my dad calls me his son, well, he's using that term in a different sense. You think the Bible ever uses it in different ways? It most certainly does. The word son is used in a variety of ways in the Bible. It's used to refer to son by education. Samuel was a son of Eli, but son by education. He was a disciple of. David was the son-in-law of Saul, but he is referred to as the son of Saul. In Matthew chapter 1, when you open up to the very first verse of the New Testament, we have the genealogy of Christ, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. The son of David, the son of Abraham. Was Jesus the direct descendant, direct son, if you will, like we normally use that word, of David? Obviously not. David was 1,000 years earlier. But notice how it's just so almost natural to see it in this context as just son. And David was 1,000 years approximately after Abraham. So we have the word son used in the very first verse of the New Testament, and it's used in a different sense than the way we normally use it. Sometimes it is used to refer to grandson. So my contention is, it is possible that in Matthew 23 and in 2 Chronicles 24, that one of those men is his father, and he is the direct son of his father, and one of those may have been his grandfather, used in different senses. Here's the last one we'll go over tonight, and then we'll close it out from here. We've mentioned this already this weekend about the potter's field that was purchased with the wages of iniquity. The question is, was it purchased by the chief priest, or was it purchased by Judas? Well, Judas had already gone out. Wait a minute, was it Judas? Did he go out and hang himself, or was it the chief? Which one is it? Well, could you ever see a scenario where someone could say they have done something or are doing something through another person? I think one of the easiest examples to use, but one that is somewhat not so comfortable, is when someone has murdered someone else. let me ask you this. In a court of law, if someone paid the murderer to do the murdering, could he be sentenced to life in prison? Or certainly. In fact, he might even be sentenced. He might receive a bigger punishment than the one who actually killed. Let's say someone gave you $1 million to commit a terrible crime. That person who gave the $1 million may, I don't know, might be prosecuted to the fullest extent. And I wonder if he would receive a worse punishment than the one who actually did the evil act. I'm not saying he should. I'm just saying we can understand how someone can act through another and that person could be guilty of murder. Well, when we go through the Bible, we can see there are individuals who acted through another. For example, in John 4 and verses 1 and 2, we can see where Jesus baptized more than John, but Jesus, he didn't literally do the baptizing. It wasn't because it wasn't necessary for salvation. Jesus says it was in Mark 16:16. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. Why did he not do the baptizing? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us why. Again, we could come to some possible reasons why. I would think maybe he didn't do it because he didn't want people rejoicing to teach people that they need to rejoice in the one who does the baptizing. I don't know why. The text doesn't tell us. But even though it says he baptized, the very next phrase says he actually didn't do the baptizing. And when Jesus was scourged, and the Bible tells us that Pilate went out and scourged Jesus, do we assume that Pilate literally did that? No, that he did it. It was done by his authority. And so when we see verses like the previous ones that we looked at in Matthew 27 and Acts chapter 1, it can be done through someone else and be stated to be done by either one of them. The first car I ever purchased was a I don't know what it was, Ford Escort that cost about $1,700. And my dad, that was a kind of mutual agreement. My dad helped me out some, and I was very thankful for that. And if I remember correctly, I paid part of it, and he helped me. It was very much a joint effort, okay? So if my dad said he bought the car, am I going to argue with him? No. If I told my friend that I bought the car and my name was on the paperwork and all that stuff, could that be a true statement? It certainly could be. If a dad hands his son, I don't recommend this necessarily, $3,000 and says, go buy a car, and he buys the car, could the son say he bought the car? Yes. Could the son say the dad bought the car? He most certainly could. Again, isn't it interesting that so many of these questions that are asked and criticisms that oftentimes are levied against what the Bible writers wrote. It's interesting to me how, number one, just some serious consideration of them normally solves a lot of the problems, and how often it is the case that if we would just be as fair with the Bible writers as we are with each other in understanding and coming to a realization of truth, then we wouldn't have all the problems that we have today. Look forward to being with you in the morning in the Bible class period, looking at specifically some questions about Jesus and answering some of the critics, what the critics have said about him in the Bible class period, and then looking at salvation in the worship hour. I'll hand it back over to John.